the Empire's key concerns in the Balkans and proposing the remedies. The Mateshko Memorandum, which was drawn up in consultation with Forgash and Berchtold and passed to the Foreign Minister's desk on 24th of June, is the clearest picture we have of Vienna's thinking in the summer of 1914. It is not a cheerful document. Mateshko notes only two positive Balkan developments: signs of a rapprochement between Austria-Hungary and Bulgaria, which had finally awakened from the Russian hypnosis, and the creation of an independent Albania. But Albania was not exactly a model of successful state-building. Levels of domestic turbulence and lawlessness were high, and there was a general agreement among Albanians that order would not be achieved without external help. And almost everything else was negative. Serbia, enlarged and strengthened by the two Balkan wars, represented a greater threat than ever before. Romanian public opinion had shifted in Russia's favoring the question of when Romania would break formally with the Triple Alliance to align itself with Russia. Austria was confronted at every turn by a Russian policy, supported by Paris, that was, in the last resort, aggressive and directed against the status quo. For now that Turkey in Europe had been destroyed, the only purpose behind a Russian-sponsored Balkan League could be the ultimate dismemberment of the Austro-Hungarian Empire itself, whose lands Russia would one day feed to its hungry satellites. What was the remedy? The memorandum focused on four key diplomatic objectives. First, the Germans must be brought into line with Austrian Balkan policy. Berlin had consistently failed to understand the gravity of the challenges Vienna faced on the Balkan Peninsula and would have to be educated towards a more supportive attitude. Secondly, Romania should be pressed to declare where its allegiances lay. The Russians had been courting Bucharest in the hope of gaining a new salient against Austria-Hungary. If the Romanians intended to align themselves with the Entente, Vienna needed to know as soon as possible so that arrangements could be made for the defense of Transylvania and the rest of eastern Hungary. Thirdly, an effort should be made to expedite the conclusion of an alliance with Bulgaria to counter the effects of the deepening relationship between Russia and Belgrade. Finally, efforts should be made to woo Serbia away from a policy of confrontation using economic concessions, though Mateshko was skeptical about whether it would be possible by this means to overcome Belgrade's hostility. There was an edgy note of paranoia in the Mateshko Memorandum, a weird combination of shrillness and fatalism that many Austrian contemporaries would have recognized as characteristic of the mood and cultural style of early 20th century Vienna. But there was no hint in it whatsoever that Vienna regarded war, whether of the limited or the more general variety, as imminent, necessary, or desirable. On the contrary, the focus was firmly on diplomatic methods and objectives, in accordance with Vienna's self-image as the exponent of a conservative policy of peace. Conrad, on the other hand, who had been recalled to the post of Chief of Staff in December 1912, remained robotically committed to a war policy. But his authority was on the wane. In May 1913, it was discovered that Colonel Alfred Redl, former Chief of Military Counterintelligence and Chief of Staff of 8th Army Corps in Prague, had been routinely passing top-level Austrian military secrets to St. Petersburg, including entire mobilization schedules, the outlines of which were forwarded in turn by the Russians to Belgrade. The scandal shed an unflattering light on Conrad's skill as a military administrator. To say the least, for all appointments at this level were his responsibility. Redl was a flamboyant homosexual whose indiscreet and expensive liaisons made him an easy target for the blackmail specialists of Russian intelligence. How, one might ask, had this escaped the notice of Conrad, the man who had been responsible for monitoring Redl's progress since 1906? It was widely noted that Conrad took little interest in this aspect of his work and only a sketchy acquaintance with many of the most senior military appointees. He compounded his error by having the disgraced colonel pressed to commit suicide with a pistol handed to him in a hotel room. Redl turned the pistol on himself, an ugly denouement that offended the devoutly Catholic heir to the throne and, more to the point, deprived the General Staff of the opportunity to extract from Redl a full account of what had been passed to St. Petersburg and how. This may have been Conrad's precise intention, For it emerged that the persons involved in trafficking Austrian military secrets included a staff officer of South Slav heritage by the name of Chedomil Jandrich, who happened to be a close friend of Conrad's son, Kurt. Chedomil and Kurt had been classmates at the military academy and often went out drinking and merrymaking together. Evidence emerged to suggest that Jandrich, together with the Italian mistress of Hertzendorf Jr. and various other friends from their circle, had been involved in selling military secrets to the Italians, most of which were then passed by the Italians to St. Petersburg. Kurt von Hertzendorf may himself have been directly implicated in espionage activity for the Russians. If the claims of Colonel Mikhail Alexeyevich Svechin, who was then military intelligence chief for the St. Petersburg military district, are to be believed. Svechin later recalled that the Austrian agents supplying Russia with high-quality military intelligence included the chief of staff's son, who, it was claimed, had stolen into his father's study and removed General Staff war planning documents for copying. The impact of these bizarre entanglements on Conrad can easily be imagined. The full extent of Kurt von Hertzendorf's culpability, if indeed he was himself an agent, was not revealed at the time, but at a high-ranking meeting chaired by Conrad in Vienna during May 1913, it was announced that the young man had been found guilty of withholding important information about his compromised associates. Having urged the meeting to mete out the severest possible penalty, Conrad became dizzy, surrendered the chair, and was obliged briefly to leave the room. For all his arrogance, the staff chief was proudly demoralized by the Redl disaster, so much that he was uncharacteristically quiet during the summer months of 1913. Franz Ferdinand was still the most formidable obstacle to the war policy. The heir to the throne worked harder than anyone else to neutralize the impact of Conrad's counsels on the leading decision-makers. In early February 1913, barely 6 weeks after Conrad's recall to office, Franz Ferdinand reminded him during a meeting at Schönbrunn Palace that it was the duty of government to preserve peace. Conrad replied with his usual candor, but certainly not at any price. Franz Ferdinand repeatedly warned Berchtold not to heed the arguments of the Chief of the General Staff and sent his aide, Colonel Karl Bardolph, to Conrad with a stern instruction not to drive the foreign minister to an action. The Archduke, Conrad was informed, would countenance under no circumstances a war with Russia. He wanted not a single plum tree, not a single sheep from Serbia. Nothing was further from his mind. Relations between the two men grew increasingly fractious. In the autumn of 1913, the hostility between them broke into the open. Franz Ferdinand sharply reprimanded the Chief of the General Staff before a gathering of senior officers for changing the dispositions of the maneuvers without consulting him. Only the mediation of Franz Ferdinand's former staff chief, Brosch von Ehrenau, prevented Conrad from resigning. It was only a matter of time before Conrad would be forced from office. Since the Redl case, one of the Archduke's aides recalled the chief was a dead man, and it was just a question of setting a date for the funeral. After further angry exchanges at the Bosnian summer maneuvers of 1914, Franz Ferdinand resolved to be rid of his troublesome chief of staff. Had the Archduke survived his visit to Sarajevo, Conrad would have been dismissed from his post. The Hawks would have lost their most resolute and consistent spokesman. In the meanwhile, there were signs of improvement, on the surface at least, in diplomatic relations with Belgrade. The Austro-Hungarian government owned a 51% share of the Oriental Railway Company, an international concern operating on an initially Turkish concession in Macedonia. Now that most of its track had passed under Serbian control, Vienna and Belgrade needed to agree on who owned the track and who should be responsible for the cost of repairing war damage and how and whether work on it should continue. Since Belgrade insisted on full Serbian ownership, negotiations began in spring 1914 to agree a price and conditions of transfer. The discussions were complex, difficult, and occasionally rancorous, especially when arbitrary interventions by Pasich on minor points disrupted the flow of negotiations, but they received some positive coverage in the Austrian and Serbian press, and they were still underway when the Archduke travelled to Sarajevo. A further encouraging development was an agreement at the end of May 1914, after months of official wrangling, to exchange a small number of prisoners held by both states on charges of espionage. These were modest but hopeful indications that Austria-Hungary and Serbia might in time learn to live as good neighbors. Part 2. One Continent Divided. Chapter 3. The Polarization of Europe, 1887 to 1907. If you compare a diagram of the alliances among the European great powers in 1887 with a similar map for the year 1907, you see the outlines of a transformation. The first diagram reveals a multipolar system, in which a plurality of forces and interests balance each other in precarious equilibrium. Britain and France were rivals in Africa and South Asia. Britain confronted Russia in Persia and Central Asia. France was determined to reverse the verdict of the German victory of 1870. Conflicting interests in the Balkans gave rise to tensions between Russia and Austria-Hungary. Italy and Austria were rivals in the Adriatic and quarrelled intermittently over the status of Italophone communities within the Austro-Hungarian Empire, while there were tensions between Italy and France over the latter's policy in northern Africa. All these pressures were held in check by the patchwork of the 1887 system. The tripled alliance between Germany, Austria, and Italy, 20th of May 1882, prevented the tensions between Rome and Vienna from breaking into open conflict. The Defensive Reinsurance Treaty between Germany and Russia, 18th of June 1887, contained articles deterring either power from seeking its fortunes in war with another continental state, and insulated the Russo-German relationship against the fallout from the Austro-Russian tensions. The Russo-German link also ensured that France would be unable to build an anti-German coalition with Russia, and Britain was loosely tied into the continental system through the Mediterranean Agreement of 1887 with Italy and Austria, an exchange of notes rather than a treaty whose purpose was to thwart French disturbances in the Mediterranean and Russian ones in the Balkans or the Turkish Straits. Move forward 20 years to a diagram of the European alliances in 1907, and the picture has changed utterly. You see a bipolar Europe organized around two alliance systems. The Triple Alliance is still in place, though Italy's loyalty to it's increasingly questionable. France and Russia are co-joined in the Franco-Russian alliance, drafted in 1892 and ratified in 1894. Which stipulates that if any member of the Triple Alliance should mobilize, the two signatories will, at the first news of this event and without any previous agreement being necessary, mobilize immediately the whole of their forces and deploy them with such speed that Germany shall be forced to fight simultaneously on the east and on the west. Britain is linked to the Franco-Russian alliance through the Entente Cordiale with France, 1904, and the Anglo-Russian Convention of 1907. It will be some years before these loose alignments tauten into the coalitions that will fight the First World War in Europe, but the profiles of two armed camps are already clearly visible. The polarization of Europe's geopolitical system was a crucial precondition for the war that broke out in 1914. It is almost impossible to see how a crisis in Austria-Serbia relations, however grave, could have dragged the Europe of 1887 into a continental war. The bifurcation in two alliance blocs did not cause the war. Indeed, it did as much to mute as to escalate conflict in the pre-war years. Yet without the two blocs, the war could not have broken out in the way that it did. The bipolar system structured the environment in which the crucial decisions were made. To understand how that polarization came about, it is necessary to answer four interlinked questions. Why did Russia and France form an alliance against Germany in the 1890s? Why did Britain opt to throw in its lot with that alliance? What role did Germany play in bringing about its own encirclement by a hostile coalition? And to what extent can the structural transformation of the alliance system account for the events that brought war to Europe and the world in 1914? Dangerous liaisons. The Franco-Russian alliance. The roots of the Franco-Russian alliance lie in the situation created in Europe by the formation of the German Empire in 1870. For centuries, the German centre of Europe had been fragmented and weak. Now it was united and strong. The War of 1870 placed the relationship between Germany and France on a permanently difficult footing. The sheer scale of the German victory over France, a victory most contemporaries had not predicted, traumatized the French elites, triggering a crisis that reached deeper into French culture, while the annexation of Alsace-Lorraine, strongly advocated by the military and reluctantly accepted by German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, imposed a lasting burden on Franco-German relations. Alsace-Lorraine became the holy grail of the French cult of revanche, providing the focus for successive waves of chauvinist agitation. The lost provinces were never the sole driving force behind French policy. Yet they periodically inflamed public opinion and exerted a stealthy pressure on the policymakers in Paris. Even without the annexation, however, the very existence of the new German Empire would have transformed the relationship with France, whose security had traditionally been underwritten by the political fragmentation of German Europe. After 1871, France was bound to seek every possible opportunity to contain the new and formidable power on its eastern border. A lasting enmity between France and Germany was thus to some extent programmed into the European international system. It is hard to overstate the world historical impact of this transformation. Relations among the European states would henceforth be driven by a new and unfamiliar dynamic. Given the size and potential military capacity of the new German Empire, the chief objective of French policy had to be to contain Germany by forming an anti-German alliance. The most attractive candidate for such a partnership, despite its very different political system, was Russia. As J.B. Eustace, the former American ambassador to Paris, observed in 1897, France had one of two courses open, either to be self-reliant and independent, falling back upon her own resources to brave every peril, or to seek to make an alliance with Russia, the only power accessible to her. If this should happen, Germany would face the threat of a potentially hostile alliance on two separate fronts. Berlin could prevent this only by attaching Russia to an alliance system of its own. This was the rationale underpinning the Three Emperors' League signed by Germany with Austria and Russia in 1873. But any alliance system incorporating both Russia and Austria-Hungary was necessarily unstable, given the two powers' overlapping Balkan interests. Should it prove impossible to contain those tensions, Germany would be forced to choose between Austria-Hungary and Russia. If Germany chose Austria-Hungary, the barrier to a Franco-Russian partnership would fall away. The German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, chief architect of the empire and the principal author of its foreign policy until his departure from office in March 1890, was fully aware of the problem and fashioned his policy accordingly. His objective, as he declared in the summer of 1877, was to create an overall political situation in which all powers, except France, need us and are kept by virtue of their mutual relations as far as possible from forming coalitions against us. Bismarck adopted a double-edged policy that aimed, on the one hand, to avoid direct confrontations between Germany and other major powers, and, on the other, to exploit the discord among the other powers whenever possible for Germany's advantage. Bismarck pursued these objectives with considerable success. He reduced the risk of British alienation by staying out of the rush for colonial possessions in Africa and the Pacific. He maintained a posture of scrupulous disinterest in Balkan affairs, declaring in a famous speech to the Reichstag in December 1876 that the Balkan question was not worth the healthy bones of one Pomeranian musketeer. When Russia's war on the Ottoman Empire in 1877-8 triggered a major international crisis, Bismarck used the Berlin Congress to persuade the powers that Germany was capable of acting as the disinterested guardian of continental peace. By mediating in the conflict over the post-war territorial settlement without seeking any direct reward for Germany, the Chancellor aimed to demonstrate that European peace and German security were in effect one and the same thing. In 1887, the heyday of the Bismarckian alliance system, Germany was tied by agreements of one kind or another to virtually every continental power. The Triple Alliance with Austria and Italy and the reinsurance treaty with Russia ensured that France remained frozen out and unable to found an anti-German coalition. The Mediterranean Agreement between Britain, Italy, and Austria, settled through Bismarck's mediation, even linked Berlin indirectly via the Triple Alliance with London. There were, however, limits to what Bismarckian diplomacy could achieve, especially in regard to Russia, whose Balkan commitments were difficult to accommodate within the fragile fabric of the Three Emperors Alliance. The Bulgarian crisis of the mid-1880s is a case in point. In 1885, a Bulgarian irredentist movement seized control of the neighboring Ottoman-ruled eastern Rumelia and announced the creation of a Greater Bulgaria. The Russian government opposed the annexation because it brought the Bulgarians worryingly close to the Bosphorus and Constantinople, the strategic apple of Russia's eye. By contrast, the British government, irritated by recent Russian provocations in Central Asia, ordered its consuls to recognize the new Bulgarian regime. Then King Milan of Serbia stirred things up by invading Bulgaria in November 1885. The Serbs were thrown back, and Austria had to intervene to prevent the Bulgarians from occupying Belgrade. In the compromise peace that followed, the Russians succeeded in blocking outright recognition of Greater Bulgaria, but were obliged to accept a form of personal union between the northern and southern Ottoman parts of the country. Further Russian interventions, including the kidnapping, intimidation, and forced abdication of the Bulgarian prince, failed to bring the Bulgarian government into obedience to St. Petersburg. In the spring of 1887, it seemed entirely possible that the Russians might invade Bulgaria and impose a puppet government, a move that Austria-Hungary and Britain were bound to oppose. The Russians ultimately decided against the incalculable risks of a war for Bulgaria, but a wave of intense anti-German feeling surged through the Russian press and public, because the Pan-Slav press now viewed Germany as the guardian of Austria's Balkan interests and the chief impediment to the exercise of Russia's custodianship over the Balkan Slavs. There was a lesson in all of this for Berlin. The Balkan problem remained. The Bulgarian crisis highlighted for a moment the immense danger latent in the instabilities of that region, namely that the activities of an unimportant lesser state might one day inveigle two great powers into a course of action tending towards war. How could this challenge be met? Bismarck's answer, once again, was to seek good relations with Russia and thereby mute conflicts of interest. Keep St. Petersburg away from Paris and exercise a moderating influence in the Balkans. The Chancellor patched up relations with the Russian Empire by agreeing the Reinsurance Treaty of 1887 with the moderate and pro-German Russian Foreign Minister Nikolai Gers. Under the terms of this agreement, Berlin promised to support Russian objectives in the Turkish Straits and to remain neutral in the event of a war between Russia and a third power, except, of course, in the case of an unprovoked Russian attack upon Austria-Hungary, whereupon Germany would observe its treaty obligations under the dual alliance to aid the dual monarchy. Not everyone in Berlin was persuaded of the wisdom of this course. Given the aggressive tone of the Russian press and the increasingly confrontational flavor of German-Russian relations, many were skeptical of the value of the Reinsurance Treaty. Even Bismarck's son, Herbert, Secretary of State for the Foreign Office, doubted the value of the latest treaty with Russia. If the worst came to the worst, Bismarck Jr. confided to his brother, the Reinsurance Treaty might keep the Russians off our necks for 6 to 8 weeks. Others, particularly within the military, succumbed to a mood of paranoia and began calling for a preventative war on the Russian Empire. An anti-Bismarck faction emerged within the senior echelons of the administration, driven by, among other things, a growing frustration with the baroque complexity and inner contradictions of the Chancellor's diplomacy. Why, the critics ask, should the Germans undertake to protect Austria-Hungary against Russia and Russia against Austria-Hungary? No other power behaved like this. Why should Germany always be hedging and balancing? Why should it alone, among the great powers, be denied the right to an independent policy founded upon its own interest? In the eyes of the anti-Bismarck Front, the Chancellor's remarkable web of transcontinental commitments looked less like a system than a creaking Heath-Robinsonian contraption, a flimsy joistwork of plasters and patches designed to avoid the pressing choices that confronted the German Empire in an increasingly dangerous world. It was in response to this current of feeling that Bismarck's successor, Chancellor Leo von Caprivi, allowed the reinsurance treaty with Russia to lapse in the spring of 1890. With the non-renewal of the reinsurance treaty between Germany and Russia, the door was open for a Franco-Russian rapprochement. But there were still obstacles. The autocrat Alexander III was an unpalatable political partner for the Republican French political elite, and the converse was equally true. It was also doubtful whether Russia would gain much from an alliance with France. After all, in a serious conflict with Germany, the Russians would probably in any case be able to count on French support. Why should they sacrifice their freedom of action in order to secure it? Were war to break out between Russia and Germany, it was virtually inconceivable that the French government would simply stand aside. At the very least, the Germans would be obliged to maintain a substantial defensive force on the French frontier, a measure that would reduce the pressure on the Russian front. And these advantages could be had without the inconvenience of a formal treaty. Although France and Russia shared an interest in opposing the imperial designs of Britain, their spheres of influence on the imperial periphery were too far apart to permit close cooperation. The French were not in a good position to support Russian objectives in the Balkans, and it seemed doubtful that Russia would ever gain from supporting French objectives in, say, North Africa. On some questions, Russia and French interests were diametrically opposed. It was French policy, for example, to block Russian designs on the Turkish Straits that might ultimately compromise French influence in the eastern Mediterranean. This was an area where common interests grouped France with Britain rather than Russia. It was also difficult to see why the Russians should compromise their good relations with Germany. There were periodic tensions between the two empires, most importantly over the question of German tariffs on Russian grain imports, but little in the way of direct clashes of interest. Russia's arguments with Berlin arose for the most part from the Balkan rivalry with Vienna. And the very fact of German power seemed an argument for tethering the two neighbors together, especially in the sphere of Balkan policy, where it was hoped that a good understanding between St. Petersburg and Berlin might have a restraining effect on Vienna. This was the formula that had intermittently worked in the era of the Three Emperors' Leagues. German neutrality was thus potentially more useful to Russia than French support. The Russians had long recognized this. This is why they had chosen to base their continental security policy on pacts with Germany in the first place. And this was why Tsar Alexander III, though he felt no personal sympathy for Germany or the Germans, had turned a deaf ear to the raging of the press and pushed ahead with the reinsurance treaty in 1887. Why then did the Russians welcome French overtures in the early 1890s? The Germans certainly facilitated the reorientation of Russian policy by declining to renew the treaty, despite the offer of improved terms from the pro-German Russian foreign minister Nikolai Gers. The modest German army bill of June 1890, which increased the peacetime strength of the armed forces by 18,574 men, also played a part inasmuch as, coming on the heels of the non-renewal, it generated a sense of threat in St. Petersburg. The departure of Bismarck and the increasing political prominence of the excitable Kaiser Wilhelm II, whom Tsar Alexander described as a rascally young fop, raised unsettling questions about the future orientation of German foreign policy. The prospect of large French loans on good terms was also attractive. But the crucial catalyst lay elsewhere, in Russian fears that Britain was about to join the Triple Alliance. The early 1890s were the high point of pre-war Anglo-German rapprochement. The Heligoland-Zanzibar Treaty of 1st of July 1890, by which the British and the Germans exchanged or ceded various African territories, and Germany acquired the tiny North Sea island of Heligoland, triggered alarm in St. Petersburg. Russian anxiety surged in the summer of 1891 when the renewal of the Triple Alliance and a visit by the German Kaiser to London prompted Germanophile effusions in the British press. Britain, trumpeted the Morning Post, had in effect joined the Triple, or rather the Quadruple Alliance. England and Germany, the Standard observed on 11th of July 1891, were friends and allies of ancient standing, and future threats to European peace would be met by the union of England's naval strength with the military strength of Germany. Press cuttings of this stripe fattened the dispatches of the French and Russian ambassadors in London. It seemed that England, Russia's rival in the Far East and Central Asia, was about to join forces with her powerful western neighbour and, by extension with Austria, her rival on the Balkan Peninsula. The result, as the French ambassador in St. Petersburg warned, would be a continental rapprochement between the cabinets of London and Berlin, with potentially disastrous consequences for Russia. The apparently deepening intimacy between Britain and Germany threatened to fuse Russia's Balkan predicament with the tensions generated by its bitter global rivalry with Britain, a rivalry that was played out in multiple theatres: Afghanistan, Persia, China, and the Turkish Straits. To balance against this perceived threat, the Russians put aside their reservations and openly pursued an arrangement with France. In a letter of 19th of August 1891 to his ambassador in Paris, Gears, who had earlier pressed for renewal of the reinsurance treaty with Germany, set out the thinking behind the quest for an arrangement with France. It was the renewal of the Triple Alliance in combination with the more or less probable adhesion of Great Britain to the political aims that this alliance pursues, that had motivated Russia and France to seek an exchange of ideas to define the attitude of our respective governments. The definition of understanding, signed between the two states in the summer of 1891, duly incorporated Gears's reference to the threat posed by British accession to the Triple Alliance. A Franco-Russian military convention followed on 18th of August 1892, and 2 years later the two countries signed the fully fledged alliance of 1894. 2 points about this sequence of events deserve emphasis. The first is that the motives for forming this alliance were complex. While the desire to contain Germany was the key factor for Paris, the Russians were more concerned with blocking Austria-Hungary in the Balkans. But both powers were also deeply concerned at what they saw as a growing intimacy between Britain and the Triple Alliance. For the Russians in particular, whose foreign policy was at this time moderately Germanophile, it was the global confrontation with the British Empire that topped the agenda, not hostility to Berlin. There was, to be sure, a vein of vivid Germanophobia in parts of the Russian leadership. Niccolo Gears was horrified to be told by Tsar Alexander III that if a war were to break out between Russia and Austria, the aim of the Franco-Russian alliance would be to destroy Germany in its current form and replace it with a number of small, weak states. But on the whole, Russian hostility to Germany was still primarily a function of Germany's relationship with Austria and of its supposedly deepening link with Britain. As late as 1900, supplementary military provisions were added to the Franco-Russian Treaty, stipulating that if an Anglo-Russian war broke out, France would move 100,000 men to the Channel coast, while if an Anglo-French war broke out, Russia would move troops to the Indian frontier along railways that Russia promised to improve with the aid of French finance. Secondly, it is worth noting the novel quality of the Franco-Russian alliance of 1894. By contrast with the earlier alliances of the European system, such as the dual and triple alliances and the League of Three Emperors, this one came into life as a military convention whose terms stipulated the combined deployment of land forces against a common enemy. A naval convention was added in 1912. The aim was no longer to manage adversarial relations between alliance partners, but to meet and balance the threat from a competing coalition. In this case, the Franco-Russian alliance marked a turning point in the prelude to the Great War. The formation of the Franco-Russian alliance did not in itself make a clash with Germany inevitable or even likely. The alliance soon acquired an anchorage in the popular culture of both countries, through the festivities associated with royal and naval visits, through postcards, menus, cartoons, and merchandising. But the divergences in French and Russian interests remained an obstacle to close collaboration throughout the 1890s. French foreign ministers took the view that since the Russians were unwilling to fight for the return of Alsace-Lorraine, the alliance with St. Petersburg should impose only minimal obligations on France. The Russians, for their part, had no intention of allowing the alliance to alienate them from Germany. On the contrary, they saw it as placing them in a better position to maintain good relations with Berlin. As Vladimir Lambsdorff, chief assistant to the Russian foreign minister, put it in 1895, the purpose of the alliance was to consolidate Russia's independence of action and to guarantee France's survival, while at the same time restraining her anti-German ambitions. During the first decade of the alliance, Russian policymakers, chief among them the Tsar, were preoccupied not with Central or Southeastern Europe, but with the economic and political penetration of northern China. More importantly, the shared suspicion of Britain that had helped to bring about the Franco-Russian alliance also prevented it, for a time at least, from acquiring an exclusively anti-German orientation. Russia's interest in securing informal control over Manchuria brought St. Petersburg into conflict with British China policy and ensured that relations with London would remain far more tense for the foreseeable future than those with Berlin. The Judgment of Paris. For France, too, there were difficult decisions to be made about how to balance the imperatives generated by rivalry with Britain with those arising from relations with Germany. During the first 4 years of the Franco-Russian alliance, the French foreign minister, Gabriel Hanotaux, adopted a firmly anti-British policy. Egged on by the leader articles of the French colonialist press, Hanotaux mounted a direct challenge to the British presence in Egypt, a policy that culminated in the surreal Fashoda incident of 1898, when a French expeditionary force made an epic journey across Africa to stake a claim on the Upper Nile, while British troops marched south from occupied Egypt to meet the French at Fashoda, a ruined Egyptian outpost in the Sudanese marshes. The resulting political crisis took both powers to the threshold of war in the summer of 1898. Only when the French backed down did the danger of a conflict pass. French policy vis-à-vis Germany had to take account of the priorities imposed by this colonial struggle with Great Britain. In a confidential memorandum of June 1892, Hanotaux noted that current French policy permitted only very limited collaboration with Berlin. The problem with this approach was that it left open the possibility of an understanding between Germany and Britain, the very prospect that had helped to motivate the formation of the Franco-Russian alliance. One way of avoiding Anglo-German collusion, Hanotaux speculated, might be to seek a broader Franco-German-Russian understanding. This, in turn, would enable Paris to secure German support against Britain in Egypt and thereby destroy the harmony that has existed for so long between Germany and England. Here again was that Gallic paranoia about a rapprochement between the Teutonic nations. The resulting link with the eastern neighbour would, of course, be temporary and instrumental. A lasting conciliation with Germany would be possible, Hanotaux wrote, only if Berlin were willing to cede permanently the provinces annexed in 1870. The same choices faced Hanotaux's successor, Théophile Desclassés, who came to office in the summer of 1898. Like most politically active Frenchmen, Desclassés was profoundly suspicious of Germany and constantly revisited this issue in his political writings and utterances. His ardor for the lost provinces was so intense that members of his family dared not mention the names Alsace and Lorraine in his presence. We had the confused feeling that it was too sensitive to be spoken of, his daughter later recalled. But as an imperial power bent on expanding its influence on multiple fronts, France faced other predicaments that could on occasion eclipse the confrontation with Germany. In 1893, as colonial undersecretary, it was Desclassés who had pressed for the deployment of French colonial forces to challenge Britain on the Upper Nile. When he came to office at the height of the Fashoda crisis, his first step was to back down in the hope of securing concessions from London in southern Sudan. But when London simply refused to budge, Desclassés swung back to an anti-British stance and attempted, just as Hanotaux had done, to challenge the British occupation of Egypt. His ultimate goal was the French acquisition of Morocco. In order to heighten the pressure on Britain, Desclassés tried, exactly as Hanotaux had foreseen, to bring the Germans into a consortium with France and Russia. During the autumn, winter, and spring of 1899-1900, the political weather seemed auspicious for such an enterprise. In conversations with the French ambassador in Berlin, the new German Chancellor, Bernhard von Bülow, hinted at shared Franco-German interests outside Europe. It was well known in Paris that the German press, like the French, was hostile to Britain's war on the Boer Republic. Reports of wrathful anti-British outbursts on that subject by the German Kaiser gave further cause for optimism. In January 1900, leader articles inspired by Desclasses's French office urged Germany to join forces with France on the Egyptian question, pointing out that Germany too would benefit from the neutralization of the Suez Canal, and that the combined naval forces of the continental powers would be sufficient to ensure British respect for any international settlement. Among the diplomatic community, it was common knowledge that these articles hailed from the office of Desclasses and expressed the official policy of the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs. While he waited for a German response, Desclasses prepared his colleagues in Paris with characteristic impetuosity for a war with Britain that might well be global in scope. Some suggest a landing in England, he told the French cabinet on the 28th of February 1900. Others an expedition to Egypt, yet others advocate an attack on Burma by troops from Indochina, which would coincide with a Russian march on India. It was agreed that an enlarged meeting of the Conseil Supérieur de la Guerre should be convened to consider the question of where exactly France should mount an assault on the British Empire. Britain represented a threat to a world peace, Desclasses declared, and it was time, as he remarked to a journalist in March 1900, to take a stand for the good of civilization. The British, he claimed, were working on all fronts to alienate Italy and Spain from France. They had their own beady eyes on Morocco. In later years, Desclasses became preoccupied with the American plans to seize Morocco. For a time, the visceral distrust usually directed at Berlin was refocused on London. These extraordinary deliberations came to nothing because the Germans refused to play along with Desclasses's plan for a continental league against Britain. From Berlin came the vexing proposal that the British government should be consulted before any demands were addressed to London. There was, it seemed, a gaping discrepancy between the Kaiser's anti-English verbal outbursts and the hesitant course of his foreign policy. He says, "I detest the English," Desclasses complained, "but he paralyzes everything." The real deal-breaker was Berlin's demand for something in return. On 15th of March 1900, the French ambassador in Berlin reported that the Germans would continue negotiations on the formation of an anti-British coalition only on the preliminary condition that France, Russia, and Germany should undertake to guarantee the status quo as it affected their European possessions. This was a coded request for the affirmation by France of German sovereignty in Alsace and Lorraine. This response from Berlin prompted a deep and lasting reorientation in Desclasses's thinking. From this moment, the French foreign minister abandoned any thought of Franco-German collaboration. The project of a joint démarche on Egypt was unceremoniously dropped. Instead, Desclasses gravitated via a series of intermediate positions towards the notion that French objectives could be achieved in collaboration with Britain by means of an imperial barter. The consolidation of British control over Egypt would be exchanged for British acquiescence in French control over Morocco. This arrangement had the advantage that it would prevent the dreaded, though in reality very unlikely, prospect of an Anglo-German joint initiative in Morocco. By 1903, the French foreign minister had come to believe that a Morocco-Egypt exchange should serve as the foundation for an encompassing entente with Britain. This reorientation had profound implications for Franco-German relations, for the decision to appease rather than to oppose Britain facilitated a more forceful articulation of the anti-German potential in French foreign policy. We can see this clearly in the changes in Desclasses's approach to the acquisition of Morocco. In an earlier incarnation of his program, Desclasses had envisaged using an Egyptian challenge to pressure Britain into acquiescence on Morocco and buying off the other interested powers with concessions. Spain would receive lands in northern Morocco, Italy would be offered French support for Italian ambitions in Libya, and the Germans would be compensated with territories from French Central Africa. The new post-1900 Morocco policy was different in two important respects. It was to be accomplished, firstly, in concert with Britain. More importantly, Desclassés now planned to seize Morocco, a country whose independence had been guaranteed under an international treaty, without compensating or even consulting the German government. By adopting this provocative program and holding it over the protests of his French colleagues, Desclassés laid a diplomatic tripwire in North Africa that would be activated in the Moroccan crisis of 1905. The end of British neutrality. In a speech to the House of Commons of 9th of February 1871, only 3 weeks after the proclamation of the German Empire in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, the conservative statesman Benjamin Disraeli reflected on the world historical meaning of the Franco-Prussian War. It was, he told the members of the House, no common war. Like the war between Prussia and Austria in 1866, or the French wars over Italy, or even the Crimean War. The war represents the German Revolution, a greater political event than the French Revolution of last century. There was not a single diplomatic tradition, he added, which had not been swept away. The balance of power has been entirely destroyed, and the country which suffers more and feels the effects of this change most is England. Disraeli's words have often been cited as a prescient vision of the coming conflict with Germany. But to read the speech this way, through the lens of 1914 and 1939, is to misapprehend his intentions. What mattered most to the British statesman in the aftermath of the Franco-Prussian War was not the rise of Germany, but the untethering of Britain's old enemy, Russia, from the settlement imposed on her after the Crimean War, 1853-6. Under the terms paid down by the governments of Britain and France in the Treaty of Paris of 1856, the waters of the Black Sea were formally and in perpetuity interdicted to ships of war either of the powers possessing its coasts or any other power. The purpose of the treaty was to prevent Russia from threatening the eastern Mediterranean or disrupting the British land and sea routes to India. But the political foundations of the 1856 treaty were destroyed by the defeat of France. The new French Republic broke with the Crimean settlement, pronouncing its opposition to a Russian militarization of the Black Sea. Knowing that Great Britain alone could not enforce the Black Sea clauses, Russia now pressed ahead with the building of a Black Sea battle fleet. On 12th of December 1870, news reached London that Russia had repudiated the peace of 1856 and was constructing a new Sebastopol, an arsenal and a port for ships of war, in the town of Poti on the eastern coast of the Black Sea, only a few miles away from the Turkish frontier. It seemed that a new era of Russian expansionism was dawning, and it was this prospect that captured Disraeli's attention in the speech of 9th of February 1871. For 200 years, Disraeli observed, Russia had pursued a policy of legitimate expansion as it found its way to the coast. But the militarization of the Black Sea appeared to herald a new and unsettling phase of Russian aggression focused on the desire to acquire Constantinople and control of the Turkish Straits. Since Russia had no moral claim to Constantinople and no political necessity to go there, Disraeli declared that this was not a legitimate but a disturbing policy. Russia was not the only threat on Disraeli's horizon. He was also concerned at the growing power and belligerence of the United States. But the important point is that when he spoke of the German Revolution, he was not referring to the threat posed by the new Germany, but rather to the global and imperial consequences of the recent war between Germany and France, a war which had dislocated the whole machinery of states. Disraeli's speech announced a theme that would remain central to British foreign policy until 1914. During the years 1894 to 1905, it was Russia, not Germany, that posed the most significant long-term threat to British interests. The China question that exercised British policymakers in those years is a case in point. In China, as in the Balkans, the underlying motor of change was the retreating power of an ancient empire. During the early 1890s, Russian penetration into northern China triggered a cascade of local and regional conflicts that culminated into the Sino-Japanese War of 1894-95. Victorious Japan emerged as a rival with Russia for influence in northern China. China's defeat, in the meanwhile, inaugurated a race for concessions by the great powers hoping to exploit the further decay of the Chinese state. The negative energies generated by the race for China, in turn, heightened tensions in Europe. The core of the problem, from Britain's perspective, was the growth of Russian power and influence. In China, which in terms of its trade potential was infinitely more important to Britain than Africa, Russia posed a direct threat to British interests. The problem became even more acute after the international intervention to suppress the Boxer Rebellion, 1898 to 1901, when the Russians capitalized on their role in the intervention to reinforce their position in northern China. Yet, in view of the Russian Empire's geographical location and the preponderance of its land forces, it was hard to see how its penetration of East Asia could be resisted. A new great game was opening up that Russia seemed likely to win. India was another vulnerable frontier. British policymakers observed with alarm that the steady penetration of the Russian railway system into Central Asia meant that Russia enjoyed better military access to the subcontinent than Britain itself. Since Russia appeared to be pursuing an anti-British policy in Central Asia and the Far East, and France was a rival and challenger of Britain in Africa, the Franco-Russian alliance appeared from London's perspective to be a chiefly anti-British device. The problem was particularly pressing during the Boer War, when the deployment of substantial troop contingents in South Africa left northern India exposed. In August 1901, a report by the Intelligence Department of the War Office on the military needs of the Empire in a war with France and Russia concluded that the Indian Army was in no position to defend its key strongpoints against a Russian attack. To make matters worse, Russian diplomats were not merely, in British eyes, hostile, expansionist, and ruthless, but also prone to underhandness and false dealing. The lying is unprecedented even in the annals of Russian diplomacy, Lord George Hamilton, Secretary of State for India, reported in March 1901, during negotiations towards a settlement in China. Russia's diplomacy, as you know, is one long and manifold lie, George Curzon, Viceroy of India, told the Earl of Selborne, the First Lord of the Admiralty, in 1903. British policymakers responded to the Russian threat by pursuing a two-track policy. The first involved rapprochement with Japan and France. The second, the quest for a power-sharing agreement with Russia itself that would take the pressure off Britain's imperial periphery. In the aftermath of the Sino-Japanese War of 1894-5, Britain and Japan shared a common interest in opposing further Russian expansion. Japan was Britain's natural ally in the Far East, as Foreign Secretary Kimberley put it in a letter of May 1895 to the British minister in Tokyo. The threat posed to Russia's Chinese frontier by Japan's formidable land forces, 200,000 Japanese troops had entered Manchuria by the end of 1895, would offset the vulnerability of the British imperial periphery in northern India. The swiftly growing Japanese fleet would provide a further counterpoise to the Russians and thereby relieve the strain on Britain's overstretched fleets. In 1901, after a long period of cautious rapprochement, discussions began with a view to a formal alliance. First, a naval defense pact, later the more encompassing agreement signed in London on 30th of January 1902. Renewed with expanded terms in 1905 and in 1911, the Anglo-Japanese alliance became a fixture in the international system of the pre-war world. The same logic underlay the British decision to seek an understanding with France. Already in 1896, Lord Salisbury had found that concessions to France along the Mekong Valley in the borderlands between British Burma and French Indochina produced the welcome side effect of drawing the French in and temporarily loosening the cohesion of the Franco-Russian alliance. The Entente Cordiale of 1904 was, by the same token, not primarily an anti-German agreement, at least not from Whitehall's perspective, but one that was intended to mute colonial tensions with France, while at the same time generating some measure of indirect leverage on Russia. Desclassés had encouraged this speculation by suggesting that if an entente were to come into being, France would exercise a restraining influence on Russia and even make it clear to St. Petersburg that French support would not be forthcoming if Russia were to pick a fight with Britain. There was thus good reason to hope, as Lord Lansdowne put it, that A good understanding with France would not improbably be the precursor of a better understanding with Russia. The last point is important. At the same time as they balanced against Russia with Japan, British policymakers strove to meet the Russian challenge by tethering St. Petersburg to an imperial power-sharing agreement. There was no contradiction in this. As Sir Thomas Sanderson, Permanent Under-Secretary at the Foreign Office, observed in a letter to the British ambassador at St. Petersburg in May 1902, the Japanese alliance was useful precisely because, until the Russians see that we can take our pigs to other markets, we are not likely to bring them to book. It would thus tend to promote rather than discourage Britain's chance of some definite understanding. British security reviews continue to envisage catastrophic scenarios in Central Asia. The Russians, the British cabinet was told in December 1901, were capable of pouring 200,000 troops into Transcaspia and the Herat. In order to prevail against such a force, the British garrison in India would have to be increased permanently by between 50,000 and 100,000 men at huge cost to the government. This at a time when the best financial advice called for drastic cuts in expenditure. And the frenzied pace of Russian railway building to the Afghan frontier suggested that the situation was swiftly developing to Britain's disadvantage. These concerns were further amplified by the outbreak of war between Russia and Japan in February 1904. The fact that Russian forces at sea and on land performed rather poorly against their Japanese adversaries at first did nothing whatsoever to mute British anxieties. What if, as Viscount Kitchener warned, the Russians were tempted to offset their losses against Japan by threatening India? In this event, India would require massive reinforcements. By February 1905, the projected figure was 211,824 troops, according to Government of India estimates. The attendant rise in expenditure would be enormous. Kitchener's estimated that countering the menacing advance of Russia would cost 20 million plus an annual charge of another £1.5 million. This was a matter of some consequence for the Liberal government that came to power in 1905, promising to cut military costs and expand domestic programs. And if Britain could no longer afford to defend the northwestern frontier of India by force, then it followed that a non-military means must be found of securing India against a Russian assault. Japan's victory over Russia in 1905 clinched the argument in favor of an agreement. Given the magnitude of the Russian defeat and the wave of domestic turbulence that paralyzed the country, the claim that the threat from Russia justified immense investment in Indian defense no longer seemed so compelling. The new Foreign Secretary, Edward Grey, came to office in December 1905, determined to see Russia re-established in the councils of Europe, and I hope on better terms with us than she has been yet. In May 1906, Grey succeeded in having the option of Indian reinforcements placed on the back burner. One aspect of this entangled tale of imperial readjustments deserves particular emphasis. Neither the Entente Cordiale with France nor the convention with Russia was conceived by British policymakers primarily as an anti-German device. Inasmuch as Germany figured in British designs, it was mostly as a subordinate function of tensions with France and Russia. The German government excited resentment and anger above all when it appeared to make common cause with Russia and France against Britain. As in the spring of 1895, for example, when Germany joined its two great power neighbors in pressuring Tokyo to return to China territory conquered during the Sino-Japanese War, or in 1897, when the Germans unexpectedly seized a Chinese bridgehead at Kachau, Jiaozu, on the Shantung Peninsula, a move that London rightly believed had been secretly approved and encouraged by the Russians. In both cases, German actions were read against the background of perceived French and Russian designs against Britain. In the Chinese theatre, as elsewhere, Germany was a diplomatic irritant rather than an existential threat. Anglo-German antagonism was not, in other words, the primary determinant of British policy. Indeed, until around 1904-05, it was more often than not the function of other more pressing concerns. Belated Empire, Germany. The primary aim of German foreign policy in the Bismarck era was to prevent the emergence of a hostile coalition of great powers. For as long as it continued, the tension between the world empires made this objective relatively easy to accomplish. French rivalry with Britain intermittently distracted Paris from its hostility towards Germany. Russia's hostility to Britain deflected Russian attention from the Balkans and thus helped to stave off an Austro-Russian clash. As a mainly continental power, Germany, so long as it did not itself aspire to found a global empire, could stay out of the great struggles over Africa, Central Asia, and China. And as long as Britain, France, and Russia remained imperial rivals, Berlin would always be able to play the margins between them. This state of affairs enhanced the empire's security and created a certain wriggle room for the policymakers in Berlin. But the Bismarck strategy also exacted a cost. It required that Germany always punch under its weight, abstain from the imperial feeding frenzies in Africa, Asia, and elsewhere, and remain on the sidelines when other powers quarreled over global power shares. It also required that Berlin enter into contradictory commitments to neighboring powers. The consequence was a sense of national paralysis that played badly with the electors whose votes determined the composition of the German national parliament. The idea of colonial possessions, imagined as Eldorados with cheap labor and raw materials and burgeoning native or settler populations to buy national exports, was as bewitching to the German middle classes as to those of the established European empires. It should be noted that even modest German efforts to overleap the power political constraints on imperial expansion met with sturdy resistance from the established world powers. In this connection, it is worth recalling an obvious but important difference between the belated German Empire and its world imperial rivals. As the possessors of vast portions of the Earth's inhabited surface with a military presence along with extended imperial peripheries, Britain, France, and Russia controlled tokens that could be exchanged and bargained over at a relatively little cost to the metropolis. Britain could offer France concessions in the Mekong Delta. Russia could offer Britain a demarcation of zones of influence in Persia. France could offer Italy access to coveted territories in northern Africa. Germany could not credibly make such offers because it was always in the position of a parvenu with nothing to trade, pushing to gain a place at an already crowded table. Its attempts to secure a share of the meager portions that remained usually met with firm resistance from the established club.